Hello everybody, welcome to Tano's Hardcore Media, and this is something I've been wanting to do for a while, the Darien Gap. I want to go through how dangerous it is, and we're going to be looking at different channels, going through different things, conditions, what people have to go through, and the dangers they have to go through for migrants, illegals coming through here. And it's important to see different sides of things. Let me see, I turn on the audio on some of this stuff here. Boom, 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 boom. Here's part one of this here.
Coming up on The Whole Story.
This is just one enormous traffic jam of people through the jungle.
Este es horrible, este es horrible, este es horrible.
Everybody look tired. Everybody maybe you die here.
Donc vous êtes ici toute seule?
Good evening, welcome to The Whole Story. I'm Anderson Cooper. Starting tonight, we are bringing you the best of CNN storytelling from our reporters and anchors all over the world. It's one whole story, one whole hour, every Sunday at 8 p.m. Tonight, we take you on a dangerous and difficult journey through the Darien Gap, the only land route connecting South America to Central America. It's a 66-mile stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama, so
You saw the gist of that.
Darien es como una pesadilla que uno estuviera en la pesadilla con los 1001 demonios. Realmente uno aquí se encuentra con muchas cosas que uno no se imagina, pues, y obstáculos que uno tiene que superar y cosas que uno no creía que las iba a hacer y que iba a pasar por esto. Y mucha gente no las supera.
Y entonces yo soy cocinera, yo trabajaba en Uruguay en un buen restaurante y cerró por el COVID también, ya no tenía vida. Y dije, bueno, tengo que seguir adelantando.
Que es cuando empezamos a entrar a la selva, eran prácticamente como 600 inmigrantes. O sea, un grupo de 600 entre todos, entre haitianos, venezolanos, cubanos, y ahí van saliendo por grupos como de 50, de 60, y van.
Inicialmente con 2 guías que nos colaboraron en el grupo y nos hicieron una avanzada más o menos de un día y una noche y un día. Hasta un punto que es un río y ya allá le dicen a uno que va a comenzar a tomar la famosa montaña de la muerte.
Está derrumbado por completo. Imagínate que es una loma uniéndose con otra loma. Y lo que lo unía se derrumbó. ¿Y qué quedó? Un filo que es de este ancho así y el peñasco para abajo.
La muchacha se resbaló y cayó por el precipicio y ¡guau! Me dio un dolor en el corazón de no poder hacer nada. Y las demás personas vieron, gritaron, pero siguieron. Seguimos subiendo. Ya de tanto subir la loma, tanto subir la montaña, la gente bota su peso. Bota ropa, comida, bolso, carpa. Y llegamos al río. El sitio más peligroso que yo hice es el río.
Yeah.
Hay un que le dicen, creo que 3 cruces, que fue horrible porque teníamos que cruzar y en el cruce se llevó a 2 haitianas a la otra orilla del río. La arrastró el río y logramos cruzar por otro lado, que era la corriente más bajita, pero era más hondo. Y una vez que cruzamos, que subimos la montaña, que bajamos, me dice mi amigo cubano, ah, eso es una niña. Y pasó una niña, cada vez de una niña haitiana por delante de nosotros. Toda la noche soñando con eso.
la mayor parte de mi recorrido fue con un señor ya de edad. Él me dijo, él miró hacia más adelante y me dijo, nos van a asaltar.
Pistolas, cuchillos. A una muchacha se la llevaron sola, asustada a ella, el esposo estaba que se paraba.
So some of people want to run. It's me, not it's the group. I speak to them. I say, no, I say, everybody cool down. I say, yeah, there is no way to go.
Dejamos 2 días antes de donde me recogió la lancha y estaba en la punta de una loma, dentro de la casa de campaña, ahí esperando y un señor mayor, porque la esposa estaba afuera y decía, por favor, azúcar, alimento, y nosotros le dimos también.
And I want to present this because fact is, as much as I do get pissed off about illegals coming to this country and migrants, there is another side to this, and not all are bad. And I have to do this video because of that. And I don't want anybody, see that I'm like this vengeful or hateful person. We're a nation of migrants, and even native tribal people here, Native Americans, this is stupid crazy. Jesus Christ. Native Americans, Indians, whatever, fuck. I gotta say that, these stupid ass words, I swear to God, people love to be offended so much. Sorry, I have to say this, I just get pissed off. People get offended so easy if you don't say the right wording, but, even Native Americans migrated here, and we all migrate from somewhere, and stuff like that. And the way that's happening in America is, in Europe, the UK is wrong and stuff like that. But we need to also remember that it is politicians that are at fault. It is not the people. It's also other governments or countries that are at fault for letting this happen. But we can't lose also sight of the other side and what they have gone through and everything like that. And I think that I just had to do this because of that. And here, where to go here?
That later.
Yo la tomé porque yo siempre vivo con mi hijo solo.
Longest road. It connects North and South America, except for a dense, impenetrable spanning 30,000 kilometers from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska to Ushuaia all the way down in Argentina. The Pan American Highway is the world's longest road. It connects North and South America, except for a dense, impenetrable jungle on the Panama-Colombia border. This is the Darien Gap. Known locally as El Tapón, or the Plug, the only land bridge between the Americas. This 106-kilometer break in the Pan American Highway is deep, dense jungle. It is one of the last great untamed places on Earth, one of the world's most biodiverse locations, an incredibly beautiful piece of nature. But to those passing through, it is
Una pesadilla con los mil y un demonios.
home to just a few scattered indigenous villages. The Darien Gap is devoid of roads, bridges and infrastructure. It is a world without government oversight, a 30,000 square kilometre wall of swamp, mountains and rainforest that can only be traversed by foot or canoe. It is one of the wettest places on Earth. Temperatures soar past 35.
And keep in mind, this is also controlled by, different tribes. Some are cannibalistic. They don't like other humans go around their territory, or cartels controlled by cartels, stuff like that. You have to pay your way usually. If you want to be protected, you do, to get through this.
5 degrees Celsius, while humidity is suffocatingly high. Movement is blocked by towering, mud-caked mountains, hundreds of swiftly flooding rivers, and an array of dangers including snakes, crocodiles, mosquitoes carrying dengue and malaria, narco-traffickers, anti-government guerrillas, and a place called Death Mountain. Because of all this, between 2010 and 2014, just 2,000-ish people crossed the Darien per year. In 2023, 500...
Only a couple thousand, now to
820,000 people crossed the Darien Gap. This year, 800,000 people will cross, hoping to reach the United States, Mexico, or Canada. Panama, a nation of just over 4 million people, has seen over 1 million migrants pass through in just 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of migrants from around the globe enter the Darien each year. Many never leave.
Puede decir que de jungla no tiene nada. Un río matador y muerto a montón. Le doy gracias a Dios que salimos vivos.
Hundreds of thousands of people are risking death in the jungle. This is the story of why and how they make it through against unimaginable odds. A story intertwined with ruthless cartels, catastrophic policy failures, and a cascade of deadly crises reverberating across the Americas. Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Darien region in 1501. 12 years later, the conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa led an expedition through the unforgiving jungles and mountains of the Darien. When they finally cut their way out on the other side, they became the first Europeans to lay eyes on the vast Pacific Ocean. The Spanish managed to conquer the Americas, but they couldn't conquer the Darien Gap, which became an isolated haven for British pirates who used it to attack Spanish treasure fleets, sending tons of South American gold to Europe. In 1698, Scottish banker and Whig enthusiast William Paterson came up with the idea of colonising the Darien in the name of the glorious Scottish Empire. The Scots had seen their southern English neighbours get rich colonising and wanted a wee bit of that for themselves. Paterson had never set foot in Panama, but that wasn't...
I think some people need to keep in mind this isn't just what the British Empire did. The Spanish Empire, French, etc., or the Roman. We have African tribes that do this, enslave others as well. You have this in all these other countries, Japan, China, you have Indonesia, you have Philippines, you have, in older times, you have Southeast Asia, you have Siam, it was Siam, you have Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Different countries going at each other, wanting all each other's land, enslaving each other, etc., etc., etc. Let's focus on that before people say it's just white people. Stop the bullshit right there. Right?
I'm going to stop his dream of a Scottish Amsterdam of the Indies, a trade hub with access to both oceans and the rich Asian markets. With £400,000, about 1/4 of the liquid wealth in Scotland, 2,500 Scottish colonists sailed off the Darien Gap even for British pirates who used it to attack Spanish treasure fleets, sending tons of South American gold to Europe. In 1698, Scottish banker and Whig enthusiast William Paterson came up with the idea of colonising the Darien in the name of the glorious Scottish Empire.
If people look at the subtitles like I am, you gotta know that the subtitles, you can't trust them all, of course.
The Scots had seen their southern English neighbours get rich colonising and wanted a wee bit of that for themselves. Patterson had never set foot in Panama, but that wasn't going to stop his dream of a Scottish Amsterdam of the Indies, a trade hub with access to both oceans and the rich Asian markets. With £400,000, about 1/4 of the liquid wealth in Scotland, 2,500 Scottish colonists sailed off to the Darien Gap in 1698. As you can imagine, a bunch of Scots stuck in a tropical forest, disturbed by the strange bright glowing orb in the sky, starving and under constant attack from the Spanish, the indigenous groups and the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, didn't fare too well. Just 1 year later, only 500 colonists left the Darien Gap alive. The failed colonisation of the Darien destroyed the Scottish economy, helping to push the bankrupt kingdom into unification with England in 1707.
Who says karma did come to the Scots? I got a wee bit of Scots to me myself. Oh my god. They lost on independence. We're going after the Darien. Oh god. Oh my god. Karma is a killer.
In the 1800s, everyone from here wanted to trade with everyone from here.
Boy, they paid the price.
The problem was that the Americas were in the way, so the new rise in power, the United States, suggested carving a canal straight through the Isthmus of Darien, which would create a much faster trade route. So they sent an expedition down there in 1854 to survey the area. The US expedition disappeared into the jungle for 49 days. They battled starvation, flesh-eating parasites and insanity. 9 of the 27-man crew died. Their conclusion was that no one could build a canal here. No one should even be here. Eventually in 1914, the Panama Canal was completed by tunneling through much more forgiving terrain near Panama City.
And what this is said is that's because of World War I. We had to have that for military reasons and trade. But the biggest, of course, is the military. Trade also, I say they go both hand in hand, but you have to have that trade.
And creating a series of complicated locks to raise and lower the ships over the terrain. In 1964, just 50 years after the opening of the Panama Canal, the Americans thought it was getting a little outdated, a little inefficient, and that a new canal was needed. So they came up with a plan. The plan was to use 325 nuclear explosives to blast a 100-kilometer trench through the Isthmus of Darien.
This is our military-industrial complex, people. Our nuclear bombs at work just kill everything. Yeah, that would kill everything. Yeah, everything.
A contemporary New York Times article suggested that this great peaceful use of nuclear energy would be safe because the Darien was only sparsely populated. Luckily for the people who were that sparse population, the plan didn't go ahead.
I didn't know this was going to happen.
In 1974, Alaska's Dalton Highway opened, finishing the 30,000-kilometer Pan-American Highway, connecting the Americas, with just one 100-kilometer break at the Darien Gap, which simply proved too difficult to build a proper road through. Neither the Panamanian or the Colombian governments have much presence in the Darien, so by the mid-90s, Colombian paramilitaries fighting against the state and narco-traffickers used it as a hideout, which led to a series of kidnappings, disappearances and murders. In the year 2000, 2 Brits were taken hostage for 9 months by the Marxist FARC guerrillas. In 2003, 3 backpackers were held for more than a week by the right-wing paramilitary group the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. In 2013, Jean-Philippe Brownish wrote an email to his wife. "I'm in Rio Sucio now. From here it's not far to Panama. There are supposedly quite many paths. We'll see how it goes." His body was identified 2 years later, shot by the FARC, who mistook him for an American spy. For decades, the Darien was considered a death trap with barely a few thousand people moving through per year. Then, in the 2020s, suddenly it skyrockets. Panama expects 300,000 people that passed through the Darien in 2024, a 31,900% increase from 2010, with most people coming from Venezuela, Ecuador and Haiti. But why the sudden change? Well, a major pull factor is the booming American economy and the United States' reputation as a safe country with the possibility of a dignified life for one's family.
La decisión la tomé porque yo siempre he vivido con mi hijo solo. Mi hijo tiene 16 años cuando yo salí. ¿Qué sucede? Que yo un día me acuesto.
This is the thing about our stupid politicians and our governments that made this problem happen, made the hate and discrimination and happen. Blame the politicians, not them. I mean, we can hate them wrongly, which a lot of us do, even I do. But it's the politicians, these pieces of shit politicians and other governments that tell them to come here. Mainly other governments that also tell them to come here because they don't want to be responsible for their own people. They don't want to take responsibility of making jobs, making a good economy, making life good for their people. They don't want to try and make good health care. They don't want to have good security. They don't want to use their brains because they have none. They just want to control pretty much their country without being responsible for people. And in some of these countries where there is law of war and stuff like that, honestly, one of my arguments is you should be overthrowing your government. You should be fighting your government and stuff. That, instead because, of our own situation.
Lo veo en la cama y veo que él está demasiado delgado. Demasiado, que a mí se me salieron las lágrimas de la situación con que yo estaba viviendo, porque no era fácil ver a tu...
Yeah, they have no idea that our healthcare system is bad enough as it is, and it compounds our problems with our healthcare system. When we don't get the healthcare, when American citizens don't get the healthcare that we need, and they think they could get everything.
Tu hijo en la cama y que se le vean todos los huesos, o sea, demasiado delgado, pues.
And also the existence of family members already living in the United States. It's much easier for a Haitian to move to and get a job with family in New York than it is for a Haitian to settle in Paraguay with no contacts. But the big change came in 2001, the year Haiti's Prime Minister was assassinated and was replaced by the unelected US, Canada and European Union-backed Ariel Henry, which set off pro-democracy protests across the country and allowed over 300 armed groups rebelling against Henry to seize the capital, causing violence and out-migration. But also in 2021, the United States told Mexico and other Central American states to restrict entry visas for Venezuelans and later Ecuadorians. This meant that people seeking asylum were blocked from flying to a nearby country like Mexico and then presenting themselves at the US border. And suddenly, they started to show up in the Darien. Here's a graph of Venezuelan migration to the US. The grey lines are Venezuelans arriving at the US border without crossing the Darien. The black line is the number crossing the Darien. You can see this huge drop in arrivals when Mexico restricts entry, but then you see a massive spike of people in the Darien Gap, and then later at the border. It's the exact same for Ecuadorians. With the legal way blocked, migrants were simply pushed towards the more dangerous route.
Yo no puedo volver a intentar coger la selva.
¿Por qué?
Porque la selva está muy difícil. Yo no doy en la selva. Me puedo quedar muerta en la selva. ¿Entiendes?
I should say those graphs are not entirely accurate, though. There's a lot more. Millions have come by. Millions upon tens of millions. It's not really accurate. So.
Como se han quedado muchos, porque han habido muchos muertos, que yo por lo menos no puedo subir en la loma y tengo que seguir por mi hijo, porque mi hijo me necesita. Mi hijo está en una silla de ruedas y quién es su mamá, es la que tiene que atenderlo, porque solo tiene su mamá. Yo no quiero dinero Yo lo que quiero es que me lo faciliten y que no tenga que subir esas lomas porque es que me voy a quedar en ellas. Me desespero, me vuelvo loca por llegar donde está él. Sufro, todas las libras que he bajado es de sufrir por mi hijo. Ya no aguanto tanto sufrimiento. No aguanto.
People looking to pass through the Darien Gap either move overland within South America or fly to countries like Brazil and Ecuador, which have lax visa entry laws. Once in Colombia, they make their way to the Caribbean coastal town of Necoclí, hoping to catch a ferry across the Gulf of Urabá to the outskirts of the Darien at Acandí or Capurganá, both in Colombia, which means that this journey is perfectly legal, it's just movement within Colombia. This is what makes the Darien so useful for people moving. Getting there is legal. The border of Panama is open since no infrastructure has been built in the Darien. States assumed that the death-dealing jungle acted as a hard border. Another starting point is the port city of Turbo, which is cheaper and used by migrants with fewer financial resources, particularly Venezuelans. From Turbo or Necoclí, the trip across the Darien can cost between $350 and $500, including the ferry to Acandí and the cost of a local guide. Migrants with more cash, usually the Chinese, seeking quicker and safer passage, can pay up to $1,000 or $2,000 to access the Querétaro or Caledonia routes, which could...
Keep in mind, this is like US dollars. Over there, it's like 25 cents gets you a whole friggin' meal. 10 cents to give you just also a whole meal. Over there. In South America. Okay, $350. That's months and months and months. That's like 6 months' wages. You got the Chinese over $1,000. That's the rich right there. So to have that much money is insane in a lot of ways. You think about the poor that don't have any money. Those are the ones that are just going to die. The people that have money, that's a lot of freaking money. 300, 350, 1100, 1160, 300, 350, 500. That's like 6 months to a year's wages.
Cut days off the travel time. On the Colombian side of the border, the Gulf Clan is an armed group that recruits from former right-wing paramilitaries. Armed groups have been present in the Darien area since the 1970s. These have included the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. These guerrillas waged a decades-long war against the Colombian state. The Gulf Clan has been the main armed group in the region since the FARC's 2016 peace deal with Colombia. The Gulf Clan engages in extortion and drugs, arms and people trafficking, and now dominate the migration routes and have killed community leaders in the Darien that act against them. With over 9,000 members, the Gulf Clan has hegemonic control over Urabá. The Gulf Clan takes a 20% tax on anyone involved in the migrant flow. These include the migrants themselves and people who rent their homes, sell boat trips or act.
Look at that. Look at that.
There's guides across the jungle.
I wish I could highlight that.
1,000 members, the Gulf Clan has hegemonic control over Urabá. The Gulf Clan takes a 20% tax on anyone.
Yeah, I remember looking over these videos on Darien Gap before and seeing it. Yeah, this is like a whole year's of wages for these people. This is their whole life savings for this, they say.
Involved in the migrant flow. These include the migrants themselves and people who rent their homes, sell boat trips or act as guides across the jungle. Panamanian officials estimate that the clan is making $820 million a year trafficking migrants, which means an armed criminal group is making massive profits due to restrictive immigration policies pushing migrants through the Darien.
So this is a reason why these countries, another reason why we got trafficking. Let me see. Traffickers making money, all this money, that's not this year, that's last year. The Coakley, all these groups are making billions and billions of dollars. They don't want this to stop. They're funneling this. We have to stop them. Good luck making a war and blowing these guys up. They're doing this. They don't want this to stop. These paramilitary groups in our countries and the cartels.
And Gap. What were once the tourist beaches of Necoclí have become camping grounds for thousands of migrants waiting for a ferry under the scorching sun. The sheer is making massive profits.
So Angola, Ecuador, Haiti, Bangladesh.
Due to restrictive immigration policies pushing migrants through the Darien Gap. What were once the tourist beaches of Necoclí have become camping grounds for thousands of migrants waiting for a ferry under the scorching sun. The sheer scale of the arrivals has strained local resources and contributed to food and water shortages. Migrants are charged high costs at every single stop on their journey, and some run out of cash and remain stranded in Turbo or Necoclí, where they are vulnerable to extortion, violence and human trafficking. Overcrowding has caused boats to capsize in the Gulf of Urubá, drowning the passengers. Migrants generally debark in Acandí or Capurganá. There are several alternate routes shown on screen now, like the more expensive sea routes. Once they disembark, migrants are checked by armed men to see if they have paid the toll to the Gulf clan, the evidence of which is usually a wristband or a sticker on their identity document. Right. They then start their 4 to 12 day long journey through the jungle. Around 70% of the people crossing pay for a guide. The journey is dangerous, and so the guides don't go the whole way. They switch at intervals in a kind of relay system. Some migrants reported that guides helped them carry their bags and even their children. Others said guides handed them over to criminal groups that abused them. The beginning of the trek involves hiking over the
Yeah, there's the sex trafficking, they use them as slaves. So slavery still happens. Even in South America, slavery, sex slaves, they use it for sex slaves too. Even the little girls, this stuff. I know people from videos that I've seen, guys are talking about how one guy tried to save his wife from a tribal or some type of paramilitary or whatever, right? And they told him not to. He tried to anyway. They killed both the woman and him. This happens all the time. There.
Colombia-Panama border. Most routes cross extremely steep and muddy mountains ranging as high as 1,800 meters. The highest point is named Death Mountain. Descending from Death Mountain into the valleys, migrants cross strong, chest-high rivers. In the rainy season, which lasts about 9 months, the mud makes the trek even more difficult as migrants face steep terrain, landslides and flash floods, all while carrying their entire lives, food, water and children. In 2023, 23% of the 520,000 migrants crossing the Darien were children. Half of them were under 5 years old.
Al momento de ingresar yo a la...
What stupid parents, what would allow children to go by themselves. 520,000. Half of the migrants. I have to. Yeah.
A la selva, ¿verdad? Eso fue fuerte, fuerte por, como he comentado, la lluvia, los gritos de los animales, ¿entiendes? Gente muerta, niños ahogados. Fue una experiencia horrible, horrible. Al segundo día, a mí se me pierde mi hijo. No sé cómo me descuidé yo por ayudar a otras personas y mi hijo se me perdió. Cuando me decían que ya lo diera por perdido, que siguiera mi camino porque no había vuelta atrás. El guía no te va a esperar. La gente no te va a esperar. Al segundo día, a mí se me pierde mi hijo. No sé cómo me descuidé yo por ayudar a otras personas y mi hijo se me perdió. Cuando me decían que ya lo diera por perdido, que siguiera mi camino porque no había vuelta atrás. El guía no te va a esperar. La gente no te va a esperar. Atrás quedaron mucha gente con los pies rotos, que se cayeron. Gente que tú no podías ayudar, aunque quisieras, no podías. Porque si te dejaba el grupo, te quedabas con él. O eras tú, eras tú.
People passing through the Darien sleep in makeshift camps. If they're lucky, they have rubber boots in case they...
Animals will just eat them, including insects will eat the flesh. And even if, if there is any cannibal tribes in there, they'll eat them, of course.
They step on a snake like the Bushmaster, which will bite back with a 90% death rate. Any extra weight is a massive burden, and so food tends to run out by day 2 or 3, which means that the migrants have to do a strenuous hike while hungry. Migrants have to drink water from the rivers, but the sheer number of corpses in the water makes the drinkers sick. People break bones from slipping, which is essentially a death sentence. The most common cause of death is drowning in rivers, that the migrants must cross by holding ropes tied to trees on either side of the river, carrying their heavy backpacks or children. The rivers can surge at any moment and sweep people away. Between 2014 and 2021, 253 people died in the Darien Gap. This represents only a fraction of the true figure.
Y como todo el mundo que viene por unos sueños, unas metas, mi esposo era muy trabajador, él lo que no sabía, lo inventaba. Duré 13 años viviendo con él, casi toda mi juventud. Y es el papá de mis hijas y pues me dolió mucho de lo que nos pasó porque íbamos pasando por un lado, como le digo yo a usted, muy fuerte, demasiado fuerte. Y de repente él se cayó con mis 2 hijas y es algo que es impresionante, como si fuera un remolino que lo fuera chupado. Yo me tiré, pude sacar a mis hijas, de ahí se me partió el alma, lo dejé tiradito así en una piedra porque ahí el que muere no sale, nadie nos recoge, ahí somos 1-0 a la izquierda para todo el mundo. El papá de ella era un héroe, era una persona que, mire, yo venía con 10 hombres y ninguno de los 10 hombres alzó a mis hijas. Yo venía con mi esposo y mi esposo venía con las 2.
They're told you don't help. You don't, just move on.
Since there are no police or even government oversight in the Darien Gap, bandits and gangs are free to rob and kill migrants at will. People have described being ambushed in the jungle by groups of armed men as they descend the hills on the Panamanian side of the border.
Cuando nosotros llegamos aquí en la floresta aquí de colombiana y frontera colombiana y Panamá, ahí tem mucho ladrón, está violando crianças de 10 años, de 8 años, y quitar dinero y también matando a la gente. Mucha gente muerta. Mucha gente muerta.
Doctors Without Borders are one of the only humanitarian services the migrants meet in the Darien Gap. Stationed at some indigenous villages, Doctors Without Borders assisted. Since there are no police or even government oversight in the Darien Gap, bandits and gangs are free to rob and kill migrants at will. People have described being ambushed in the jungle by groups of armed men as they descend the hills on the Panamanian side of the border.
Cuando momento nosotros llegamos aquí en la floresta aquí de colombiana y frontera colombiana y Panamá, ahí tem mucho ladrón, está violar crianças de 10 años, de 8 años, y quitar el dinero y también matando a la gente.
Había
mucha gente muerta. Mucha gente muerta.
Doctors Without Borders are one of the only humanitarian services the migrants meet in the Darien Gap. Stationed at some indigenous villages, Doctors Without Borders assisted hundreds of victims of sexual assault in 2023. Again, this is most likely a fraction of the true figure. Doctors Without Borders estimated that in December of 2023,
keep in mind, a lot of people you don't know if a lot of people's so-called children are their children even, which is why I want there needs to be DNA testing. And a lot of women and kids are afraid to report sexual assault and sex crimes.
one person was sexually assaulted every 3.5 hours while crossing the Darien Gap. Many cases remain unreported because survivors don't want to delay their...
Well, those people are right by them. They have to worry about retribution. But they're coming through, those convoys and stuff. Do you think that they're going to say something when the person right next to them could kill them? They're not going to say anything. They're scared shitless. They're not going to say a damn thing.
journey or risk being sent home. We have no idea how many of these captured people are eventually sold to human traffickers. After days of hiking, the migrants pay indigenous people to transport them downriver in wooden canoes known as piraguas to the indigenous communities of Bajo Chiquito, population 200, or Canam Membrisha, population 430. Eventually, migrants leave the villages in canoes to one of two migration reception centres at Las Blancas or San Vicente. These camps are run by Panama's border police and provide a small amount of food and accommodation. Many migrants stay in the camps and have to wait for family members that fell behind in the jungle. Family members that frequently do not reappear. Others have to wait until they themselves are no longer sick or injured. The Panamanian reception centres are overcrowded with few resources. There is barely enough food or water for the increasing number of migrants. There's not enough beds and there's not enough medicine, including ibuprofen. Most migrants are desperate to move onwards and leave the camps within hours if the Panamanians let them. One doctor treating the migrants as they left the jungle said, "One of the things that struck me from the first moment was the state of their feet, completely shredded, wounded with fungal infections." That's a strong image.
El luto inmediato, tú sales tú sales así, como que no te ríes, no lloras, como que no sientes nada, porque ya vas traumado, ya tienes el trauma demasiado grande. Entonces tú vas y armas una carpa y hay 20 personas ahí, o como 10 carpas armadas, y todas las personas, o sea, por lo menos yo era uno que decía, cónchale, yo, ¿qué hago? O sea, ¿qué hago en una selva? Estuviera en mi casa, en mi cama, con mi mamá, con mis familiares. Que verdad, esa era la mejor decisión que yo tomé, o sea.
They crawl out of the jungle suffering health emergencies including seizures, dehydration, fever, vomiting, fractured bones and risk of miscarriage. If they're lucky, they can see a doctor or nurse. If they're unlucky, they crawl out of the jungle, feet bleeding, starving and thirsty, having watched people die, and are immediately interviewed by American news media about
what do you think about Sharia law? Sharia.
Sharia.
What's that?
Sharia law. Do you support Sharia?
No. I don't like that.
Yeah.
No, I don't like that. No.
In Somalia, they either stone people to death, they will kill people if they are gay. What do you think about that? What do you think about it?
That's not be my first question.
Ilhan Omar is a Muslim as well. What do you think about Jewish people and Christian people?
Yeah, just people like us, Muslims. Everyone has his choice to become a Muslim, Christian, Jewish. Doesn't matter.
those that survive the Darien Gap are left traumatized by the...
It's to see why she asked that, see who's coming in. At the same time, I probably would have been too sensitive to ask that, but it depends how long they've been there. Yeah, it depends on how long they've been. Oh my God. Like I said, there's always a right time and wrong time to ask questions, but I think people really want to know. I do. Yeah, everyone wants to know, but yeah, it depends. There's times I would ask, and there's times I would ask.
The thought of those who are left behind, too exhausted to continue or with broken limbs, who wait for rescue that isn't coming.
Yo con mi desespero, yo le dije a un grupo de amigos que me prestaran un machete, una linterna, y me meto selva adentro yo a las 6 de la tarde con 3 personas, muy amigos míos que conocían a Selva, que me dijeron yo estoy contigo y vamos a buscar a tu hijo. El resultado que vas a buscar, sea lo que sea, tienes que aceptarlo. Fue lo que me dijeron. Me meto yo a las 6 de la tarde y camino, inclusive pasamos por unos laboratorios que ya estaban cerrados, ya no estaba habitado, donde preparan, me imagino que cocaína, droga, porque eran laboratorios de droga. Y yo dije, si nos ven aquí estamos muertos, le digo yo a ellos, porque esto es algo que no puedes tú ver. Y pasamos rápido. A las 11:30 escuché unas voces, yo silbando y llamando a mi hijo, nadie no me respondía, llorándole a Dios, pidiéndole, suplicándole que por favor me diera otra oportunidad de rescatar a mi hijo. Escuché unas voces y yo le digo, amigo, allá escucho voces. Y yo cuando veo que lo que escucho es papá.
Once they crawl out of the jungle, bruised and broken, migrants still have to cross over 4,000 kilometers, half a dozen more borders where they face constant risk of being stopped or deported. Panama's policy towards migrants is called controlled flow. Under the international law of non-refoulement, Panama can't send these people back to countries where they face threats to their lives. Panama also can't send them back into the Darien, which would be certain death. So their policy is to limit the buses leaving the migration centres daily, which creates a steady, manageable flow to the border with Costa Rica. Adam Isaacson, an analyst.
The thing is, none of these countries want to keep all these migrants. So it's like they have to either let them go up north, or they have to put them back to the Darien, which is death.
Who tracks migration, said that Panama, Costa Rica and Honduras do their best to transit migrants through safely, which protects them from interacting with criminals, and so we see less extortion and violence towards migrants in those countries. But Guatemala and Mexico are what Isaacson calls, we're going to make a show out of blocking you countries. Hoping to score points with the US, they make it difficult for migrants to legally enter and to travel, which forces the migrants to travel over dangerous routes like jungles, mountains or deserts to avoid state authorities, or they end up paying human smugglers, which exposes them to extortion, assault and forced human trafficking. In Mexico and Guatemala, state officials regularly stop and board buses and target migrants, stealing their cash, documents and phones. In Mexico, kidnappings of migrants have tripled.
So let's look here. Piedras Negras, CBP, Foreign Human Rights. First step, many people who arrive at Piedras Negras with CBP. I should know what CBP is, but I think that's probably some type of law enforcement. No, isn't that a guerrilla group or something? One of those, or a militia group? Our militia group, I think, one of the players are kidnapped and as a result miss their appointments. That's right. Coahuila, that's the northern border state of Chihuahua, recorded last year the highest number of kidnappings in 3 years. Kidnappings nearly tripled from 67 victims in 2022 during the implementation of Title 42 expulsion policy to 181 victims in 2023, these are flawed statistics. Following implementation of the asylum ban and related restrictions to access ports of entry, boy, it's a lot higher than that. Way higher. Towards underreported, yeah, no shit. Like 10 times. Or 100 times that. But it's the Mexican National Anti-Kidnapping Commissioner stated last year that the cifra negra of kidnappings in Mexico remains high, as only 1 in 10 kidnappings are reported. That's why I said 10 times at least. I'd say more like 100 times. Quoted by SN Digital, Tlaxcala, a Ciudad Juarez prosecutor reported that all kidnappings in the city in 2023 were specifically perpetrated against migrants arriving at Ciudad Juarez, as organized criminal groups have focused on kidnapping and smuggling of migrants. Human Rights First tracked reports of over 2,500 survivors. That's just counted ones, probably 10 times that. Kidnapping, torture, extortion, other violent harm against people seeking asylum and migrants while stranded in Mexico as they wait to seek U.S. asylum in a year since the ban took effect. Of these 1,300 survivors of violent harm, which there's a lot more identified during the ban's first 6 months, given underreported increase.
And violence against migrants has increased by 70%. Pregnant migrant women in Mexico have been beaten until they miscarried. Haitian migrants have been kidnapped and have had their teeth stolen. The horrors happening to these people in Mexico are so bad I can't really mention them.
All these are like to be 10, 100 times what being reported here. 100 times that number. 10 to 100 times. What about the Moros? What about Moros for his release? Crossed the Rio Grande to seek U.S. asylum protection. Though he had fled political persecution by Venezuelan police, his claim of fear to return to Venezuela was ignored. He was expeditiously removed to Mexico without receiving incredible fear. What the fuck?
In a YouTube video. The vast majority.
This is why I'm doing this video. There's good and bad with this, but the politicians of our country and theirs and these militias, these sex traffickers, these rebel groups, militias, are the cause. And you have to take them out somehow, or be able to not give them the power to be able to do this. Or else it's just going to keep happening no matter what Trump does. It isn't going to matter. There's good. I don't know.
Majority of Darien Gap migrants have been Venezuelan, Ecuadorian, Haitian and Cuban. And here's why. Suddenly in 2010,
I mean, you close the border off where they can't get through, but you have to put stuff underground as well, because there's a tunnel underground. Thing is that the root of the problem that's causing this is not.
Massive earthquake devastated Haiti. It is near impossible for Haitians to get entry visas to most countries in the Americas. So they couldn't fly to the US or a nearby country. Getting in a boat and heading to Florida was extremely dangerous. Boats frequently sank, killing every single passenger, or they were caught by the US Coast Guard and sent back. So Haitians ended up going to South American countries that did let them enter and just began walking thousands of kilometers to the US. This was still just a few hundred or thousand people a year, and 79% of them were Haitian and Cuban. The Haitian state essentially doesn't function, so passports and official documents are often really difficult for Haitians to obtain. They face more visa requirements than anyone else in the hemisphere, and so since legal pathways are restricted, Haitians looking to reach the US must travel through the gap and walk. Most Haitians didn't flee to the US though. Just after the 2010 earthquake, job opportunities created by the lead up to the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games in Brazil brought Haitians south, particularly to Brazil and Chile. Then,
we now have a name for the disease. It is COVID-19.
Than 11.4 million cases of coronavirus.
As the Chinese government scrambles to contain the virus, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing confirms the first American death.
2020 is now the deadliest year in U.S. history.
Every part of the United Kingdom is now in lockdown.
The pandemic and the lockdowns caused an economic downturn across Latin America, which led to lower wages or massive layoffs, which heavily impacted immigrants like Haitians, leaving them jobless. After the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse and the complete collapse of the state, thousands of Haitians have been forced to flee. This exodus merged with the exodus of Haitians being pushed out of Brazil and Chile. In 2021, 61% of migrants in the Darien Gap were Haitians. Venezuelans in the Darien Gap numbered just 3,000 between 2010 and 2014, but suddenly, in 2022, 150,000 Venezuelans passed through.
Turmoil in Venezuela driving millions from the country as refugees, battling a struggling economy, food insecurity, political unrest, and gang violence.
Since 2014, a devastating humanitarian crisis in Venezuela has caused one of the largest displacements in the world, with nearly 8 million Venezuelans living abroad. Venezuela's minimum wage is around $4 a month. The average salary is around $142 a month, while a kilogram of beef is about $5 and a litre of milk is $2. At first, people fleeing the country headed to other South American countries. Between 2015 and 2017, Venezuelan immigration increased by 1,388% in Chile, 1,132% in Colombia, 1,016% in Peru, 922% in Brazil, 344% in Argentina and Ecuador, 268% in Panama, 225% in Uruguay, 104% in Mexico, 26% in Spain, and 14% in the United States. But after COVID increased poverty, many Venezuelans, much like Haitians, migrated for a second time. In 2022, 42% of US asylum seeker requests came from just two countries, Cuba and Venezuela. Both are under brutal US sanctions.
It's as though the country had been frozen in time, back to 1962, to when the United States declared an economic, financial, and diplomatic embargo against its tiny.
And the thing is, with Cuba, is that they're using warfare on us with audio and technological equipment. Oh boy, they're doing like some type of psyop on us. And it's making our people sick over there that have problems with the brain over there. And that was part of the reason why we put sanctions, because they didn't have a reason to attack all of our people over there. It's like, what do you expect? You attack some of our people working over there, you're going to get sanctions.
Communist neighbor.
The sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela are supposed to inflict enough suffering on the civilian population that they eventually overthrow their own government. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the US embargoed all trade with Cuba in 1962. It is now the longest embargo in modern history. Ships that trade with Cuba cannot trade with the US, which means Cuba has to trade with more expensive markets, adding roughly a 30% tax to everything in Cuba. The United Nations has calculated that the blockade has cost Cuba over $130 billion and has deprived it of essential medical equipment like parts for a machine to detect breast cancer or masks and ventilators during COVID. Cuba was forced to develop its own COVID vaccine. President Donald Trump hardened the sanctions by designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, which restricts Cuba's access to international financing. Trump withdrew consular services in Cuba, which removed visa and family reunification programs and restricted remittances that Cubans working in the US send back to their families in Cuba, removing about $1.8 billion from regular Cubans between 2019 and 2021, which cut off vital income.
Weapons that attack the auditory system and create brain problems with our workers over there. So that's why it happened. He should report that, but he didn't. Of course, Al Jazeera won't either.
Just as the pandemic destroyed the tourism industry and ground the Cuban economy to a standstill. This isn't a video about Cuban-US relations. I'm not trying to comment on that. But regardless of what your opinion on that situation is, this series of events create a crisis that displaced Cubans from 2020 onwards. US sanctions against Venezuela began with a 2006 arms embargo after George W. Bush's unsuccessful 2002 coup against the elected President Hugo Chavez. Under Trump, sanctions were broadened to restrict oil exports and freeze Venezuelan state assets abroad. Sanctions made it difficult for Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, to sell its crude oil on the international market and cut off sales to the US, Venezuela's largest oil purchaser. Venezuela is essentially a petrostate. Oil is its lifeblood. Sanctions have cost the country between 13 and 21 billion in lost revenue per year. Without foreign currency from oil sales, Venezuela cannot afford to import goods needed to fuel its economy and feed its people. Venezuela's economy was already doing badly due to falling oil prices, but this took an economic crisis and turned it into a human catastrophe, which was kind of the point. American ex-CIA Director Mike Pompeo stated how well the sanctions were working. The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from. A 2019
Unfortunately, the people didn't rise up and weren't able to rise up and overthrow the government, which is what the plan is. When you do that, is for the people to rise up and overthrow the government. They didn't feel like doing that. Of course, it's not our job to overthrow the government either, but seeing as how the CIA failed.
Study linked US sanctions to 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela in 2017 and 2018. These sanctions would fit the definition of collective punishment of a civilian population as described in the Geneva and Hague International Conventions. Now, I'm not here to advise the American government. They don't respond to my emails. However, if you truly believe the sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela are worth it in order to overthrow their governments, you also need to realize that the effect of that is a massive increase in misery and migration out of those countries. Previously unknown in the Darien Gap, suddenly in 2022, Ecuadorians became the second most common nationality in the Darien. Nearly 60,000 Ecuadorians crossed the gap.
I mean, if they don't have the cojones to overthrow their government like they should, then maybe what we're doing, we should rethink what we're doing in the sanctions. But
in 2023, fleeing unprecedented violence in their country. Gang violence is so bad that recently gang members stormed the TV studio live on air. Until recently, Ecuador was a Latin American success story. During Rafael Correa's presidency, he increased social spending, hired minimum wage, shunned the International Monetary Fund, GDP grew, poverty dropped by 41%, and the homicide rate reached a historic low of 5.8 per 100,000 people, comparable to the US state of Wisconsin. Outmigration decreased and many Ecuadorians living abroad returned to their country. However, Correa's successor, Lenin Moreno, began cutting labour rights, development policies and public spending while reducing corporate taxes. He took a $10 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund and cut fuel subsidies, which sparked massive protests. The International Monetary Fund austerity program fired 10,000 public sector workers, mostly in healthcare. So when COVID hit, the health system collapsed, causing one of the highest per capita death rates globally in early 2020. GDP fell and austerity measures dismantled the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Security, and the National Council for the Control of Narcotics, which crippled Ecuador's security.
El Lenín Moreno está matando a su pueblo, al pueblo, cumpliendo las órdenes del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Está matando el Fondo Monetario Internacional a los pueblos indígenas del Ecuador y del mundo.
Ecuador went...
There's a lot of bad things with the IMF. There's good reasons why a lot of people hate the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as they see it as a corrupt organization, and it is.
From being one of the safest countries in the region to one of the deadliest, with a homicide rate of 44.5 per 100,000 people, reversing a decade of progress. Ecuador has only recently become an important centre for drug trafficking. Over a third of Colombia's cocaine production now flows into Ecuador. Things have exploded there for several reasons. Firstly, as an indirect result of the 2016 peace agreement in Colombia, in which the leftist guerrillas, the FARC, laid down their arms. The FARC's withdrawal from the Colombia-Ecuador border created a power vacuum that small gangs and narco-trafficking groups were happy to fight over. Ecuador remained relatively peaceful when only 1 to 2 gangs controlled most of the drug world. Now, dozens are fighting for control of territory and trafficking routes. By chance of geography, Ecuador is squeezed between the world's top coca and therefore cocaine producers. And it's one of the world's premier banana exporters, so Ecuador is home to lots of high quality ports with lots of traffic, which makes it fairly easy to smuggle cocaine out on massive boats shipping bananas. Ecuador also has a dollarized economy, which makes it perfect for money laundering, while Ecuador's austerity measures have gutted the state's security. And finally, Europeans just absolutely love cocaine.
More than a third tested positive for alcohol. Almost 1 in 10 had cocaine in their system.
I love cocaine!
70% of the cocaine that arrives in Europe is exported out of Ecuador's ports, even though it's produced in Colombia and Peru. Demand is skyrocketing, and so are cartel profits. Today, Colombia's ports are much more secure than Ecuador's are, and so Ecuador has become essentially a drug superhighway to Europe. Surrounding the ports of the Ecuadorian city of Guayaquil, the homicide rate averaged 145 per 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the most violent cities in the world. Now, tens of thousands of Ecuadorians are fleeing the violence. Central and West Africans, Middle Easterners, South Asians, and Chinese migrants are also increasingly showing up in the Darien Gap, but they only make up a tiny fraction of the migrants. Chinese migrants who can fly visa-free to Ecuador begin their journey there. In 2023, they were the largest extracontinental group found in the Darien, with more than 13,000 of them passing through, followed by Indians with 3,300 and Afghans with 2,600. The number of Venezuelans travelling through the Darien Gap decreased significantly towards the end of 2022 due to the United States introducing a humanitarian parole program which allowed selected Venezuelans, Haitians and Cubans with valid passports and financial sponsors to travel to the United States, where they could stay temporarily and apply for work and asylum. This program massively reduced the number of people travelling through the Darien Gap and arriving at the southern border, and therefore reduced the amount of people that would have died that year. But this was only temporary. You see, for people from Cuba, Ecuador, Venezuela and Haiti, getting a hold of a passport is near impossible. Less than 10% of Venezuelan migrants have a valid passport. Inside Venezuela, a passport costs about $200 in a country with a minimum wage of $4 a month. Venezuela is sanctioned by the US, so Venezuelans outside the country have difficulty accessing consulates, which makes it difficult to obtain or renew passports and other documents. People are so desperate to flee Ecuador that in 2022, the country...
It's like, how are all these people having passports that are coming through our country? How do they have the visas? They have to have a lot of money. Those are people that should be migrating here versus the poor that don't have money for visas, passports, etc. that do need help.
Literally ran out of materials needed to make passports. Getting a passport requires months of waiting, which is dangerous for people that want to flee violence. Those without a passport, which is most migrants, and those without a sponsor in the US, discovered that the parole program was not open to them, and the numbers going through the Darien increased again. All of these cascading problems intersect. The mass exodus is stripping nations such as Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Ecuador of their labour force, which makes economic recovery even more difficult, which heightens insecurity in those countries, which cause people to flee. Then, when legal routes are cut off, migrants have to pay smugglers, which increases profits for cartels, which feeds violence and insecurity, which causes more out-migration, which increases cartel profits. These people fleeing extreme poverty and violence will always see the journey as worth the risk. Migrants have done what conquistadors, Scots, and engineers couldn't. They have turned the Darien into a highway. For decades, the United States' answer has been to make the journey as difficult as possible. The facts reveal that this doesn't stop migration. Desperate people will find more dangerous ways around any restrictions, which ironically pushes them from legal ports of entry, leading to more undocumented crossings and more corpses in the Darien and the Rio Grande. If this continues, more children will die, more people will be trafficked, criminals will get richer, and it costs more to enforce deterrence rather than just hiring more people to process asylum claims faster. Migrants still arrive, they're just poorer and more traumatized now than if a safer route was open. The problem with deterrence is that the root problem causing out-migration isn't being addressed. You can't wage economic warfare on countries and be shocked when people leave. You can't consume massive amounts of cocaine and be shocked when cartels...
Of course, the thing is, it's not our responsibility. You know, we're not responsible for how governments need to be changed and when people should overthrow their ghosts. But, you know, I just want to do this video because people see the other side and stuff like that, and I could do lots of videos on this because I've seen it a lot over the years. The Darien Gap, and heard the death and the carnage and trafficking, sex trafficking, and you know, rape, robbery, and all this other stuff. So it's beyond nightmarish, you know.
Fight over the lucrative cocaine market and end up hurting lots and lots of innocent people. People want to stay in their homes. People want to live near their families where they grew up, where they can speak their native language. This is why most refugees and most asylum seekers live in the country directly next to their own. We saw how when Ecuador was thriving, people returned home. But if they're forced by circumstances, anyone would flee violence and starvation. Making legal migration more difficult makes illegal migration inevitable, which takes migration out of state control and puts it under...
Well, I mean, it looks like who he's trying to do is blame it on us. It's not our fault. It's our... Anyways, I had to do this video and stuff, see the other side of things, so, tell you your thoughts and stuff. Everybody take care and bless.